Okay.
Okay. So welcome all. Today we're having the second food talk of the day, which is a plus, of course. And it's Food Talk 35, and we have a guest, Victòria, Brugada-Ramentol. And our guest today has studied human biology and medical biotechnology in Barcelona. In 2016, so about 6-7 years ago, she moved to Portugal to do her PhD research in the field of neuroscience, specifically on the role of actions in the representation of the self using a virtual reality system, which is very curious and we want to know more about it. And during this period, she organized and presented in the Science and Cooking in the Blender event with the our Respire Conosco, Breathe With Us initiative at the Champalimau Research Center, which she is also hopefully going to talk to us about. And she likes eating brains and the proper use of common. So I think we have lots in common. But so welcome, Victòria. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. And well, the floor is yours. So feel free to tell us more about all that research and what you're doing now and how things have evolved.
Okay. So yeah, let me just share my screen.
Thank you.
I'm hoping you're seeing my presentation now.
It's perfect.
Thank you. So, okay, yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. And of course, thank you very much for this very nice introduction. I really like hearing your sentence, how you read my sentence. It's how it's supposed to be read. Yeah, I don't like eating brains. I like eating and brains. So thank you for that. So, well, and thank you everyone who's joining, and I'm very, very, very happy to be part of this today. And thank you to Ria and Ricardo for inviting me. So I would like to start, as you may have noticed from my introduction, is that food and brain is not my field of expertise. I do consider myself a neuroscientist. I have studied the brain for quite some time during my career, in my PhD, in my master's, and in my degree in biology. Well, and especially I have focused on the use of virtual reality on tricking the brain into believing that something that's not quite real can be felt as real. And apart from that, I enjoy the world of food and cooking a lot. I cook at home because it reminds me of science. I don't have a picture with me, but I actually have my spices organized in test tubes in my kitchen. And I also like science communication, and that's why in 2018, together with another set of students at the Champalimau Foundation, we organized our event, which is an initiative from the Champalimau Foundation on science communication. And we had the pleasure and the honor of counting with very special people, such as Charles Pence, who's an experimental psychologist at the Oxford University that works in multisensory integration, and sometimes regarding to the perception of flavor. Carlos Ribeiro, who is a PI in the Champalimau Foundation. He's a neuroscientist and he focuses his research on the fly. And Chef Alessandro Silva, who was also part of, like, it's his from Loco. And if you have the time, I for sure would like to invite you to go to our YouTube channel. You can see all the talks that we had in that event. They are very interesting, but actually what I'm going to be talking to you today is a little bit of an overview that we gave in that talk, and how the brain and food work together to give us the experience when we are eating. So, and this is exactly what I'm aiming to talk to you about today. Like, we have the brain, we have food, and how they interact. So the way they interact is food gives energy to the brain, and at the same time, the brain uses this energy to seek for food and select the food that we're eating to obtain energy for the rest of the body. And actually, if you want to turn off now, this is exactly what I want you to learn from this talk. Food is for the brain to get energy, and then the energy uses this energy to seek for more food. But now, let me actually tell you a little bit more about all of this. And to start with this, I would like to talk to you about the brain. So what's the brain? The brain is the central key element in our nervous system, and actually not only in ours, but in all vertebrates and in many invertebrate animals as well. The brain is extremely complex organ, and it has to be so because it controls many, many different functions, such as breathing, our behavior, and in the case of many higher beings, consciousness as well. So in very short words, what the brain does is to receive sensory information from the environment and within itself and process this information to produce some behavior or some changes to adapt to the environment. And many animals have brains, as I said, mammals, but also invertebrates such as insects, and then birds and reptiles. So it has evolved with us for many years, and the central, actually during millions of years, the central nervous system has evolved. But the brain anatomy is very different, as you can see from this figure here. It's very different across animals, and this depends on the species and what the species does and how it specializes to provide the information that the actions that the species needs to survive in the environment. So today, not to overcomplicate stuff, I really just want to talk to you about the human brain. So what you're seeing here is the depiction of a human brain, and it's composed by three very noticeable parts, which are the cerebrum, which is this bigger area here. It's actually the largest in the brain. We have the cerebellum, which is this smaller, more wrinkled area, and the brainstem. You can see it here. And I'm going to very briefly talk a little bit about this part because it's important for the rest of the talk. So the cerebrum, which is this larger area, it's composed of many parts, and one of them is the outer layer, which is the cortex. And in the cortex, it's responsible for many important functions for human cognition. The cerebrum is divided into two symmetrical hemispheres. You see this one here, but on the other side, like it's the other one that's symmetrical, they do have function in an asymmetrical manner. One of them is dominant over the other sometimes. And also an important feature about this cortex and the cerebrum is that it's divided in many regions. And that's very important because each of these regions is highly specialized in its functions, and it can be divided first in 4 big areas, which are these lobes that you can see. And they do specialize apart, and not only it's these big areas, within each of these big areas, you're going to find again like smaller regions that are specialized in one specific function or many specific functions. For example, the frontal lobe is the one that controls our movement, and is also where the gustatory cortex is found, and that's where the perception of taste happens. The temporal lobe, for example, is in charge of hearing, and it's connected very highly to memory. And the occipital lobe, it's known for taking care of vision, for example. About the other 2 areas that I specified from the brain, like we have the cerebellum, which is highly involved in balance and fine motor control, and the brainstem, which is very important. It's located here, and it then will connect with the rest of the body through the spinal cord. And it's extremely important because it controls for breathing and for example, heartbeat as well. Just very briefly, the brain is composed by brain cells, in this case neurons, but also which are the most known maybe, but it's also composed by other types of neurons, which are other types of cells, which are called the glial cells, for example, which are support cells to the neurons, and they are extremely important also for maintaining a proper cognitive function. And why the neurons typically have the shape that you see here. They have the cell body and then a very long prolongation, which is called the axon. That's what communicates this neuron with other neurons surrounding it, and through chemical or electrical information. So just to finish up with the brain in numbers, it's very interesting because like the brain weighs around, the typical human brain weighs around like 1.2, 1.4 kilograms, which on average means that it's only a mere 2% of a human body weight. But on the other side, like it consumes 20% of the body energy that we intake. So a very small part of us, it's actually taking a huge chunk of the energy that we eat. And from this 20%, 60% comes in the forms of glucose, which makes the brain the organ in our body that consumes the most amount of glucose. Recent estimates say that the brain has around 100 billion neurons, which is a lot. And not only that, it also has the same amount of numbers of non-neuronal cells, such as the glial cells I was talking about. And the neurons talk to them through these connections, through the synapses that they use this axon. And these, the current estimate says there are trillions of synapses in the brain. One number that I really would like you to go home with is, you may have heard this myth that we only use 10% of the brain. That is not true. We do use our whole brain, and this 10% comes from other estimates counting the ratio between neurons and non-neuronal cells that the brain would have. It was a 10%. They said it was a 10% before, and from this it derived to saying that we use only our 10% of the brain. We do use the whole amount of our brain to function. And speaking of functioning, what are the functions of the brain? It seems that such a high energy consuming organ needs to have a lot of roles, and it does. It controls many aspects of our existence. It controls for our movement, both voluntary movement, which is when we decide to move. If I want to walk, that would be voluntary movement controlled by the brain, but also involuntary movements such as heartbeat or the contractions of the stomach when it's digesting. All of these are involuntary movements that are also controlled by the brain. It controls for homeostasis. Homeostasis is making sure that everything in our body is working perfectly, that we are not hungry, we're not thirsty. And it also regulates the autonomic functions, which are breathing and heart beating and all of these things that actually keep us alive. So the brain is extremely important in all of this. It also processes sensory information. The fact that we process sensory information means that we take the information that the environment gives us, and then it processes it and acts accordingly. So if we are cold, for example, it feels that we're cold and it will produce an action, for example, going to a sunny spot or getting dressed. Another function of the brain is languages. Language is extremely important for us. It helps us communicate with others and with the environment and understand the information we receive from signals and from people speaking to us. So that's also controlled by the brain. Emotions. I know that it's very typical to represent love, for example, with a heart, but actually it's in the brain. So next time, maybe instead of I heart you, you should say I brain you. And finally, cognition, which is extremely important. So it's when we learn, we memorize, we are attending to something in problem solving, in arithmetic, all of these happens in the brain. So as you can see, the brain has a lot of important functions, but for the purpose of today, actually, I'm just going to be talking mainly about these two, maintaining homeostasis and the processing of sensory information and how this is related to food. So first of all, let me start by giving you a definition of homeostasis. Homeostasis is the process of self-regulating that an organism does to maintain the stability at the same time that it's adjusting to the conditions that are best in regard to the environment that this organism is in. So for example, our body works at a very specific range, in very specific ranges. We need to have this proper amount of oxygen in our blood, this proper amount of energy available to us to do those things, this proper amount of water, and all of this is controlled by sensors, cellular sensors in our body that send information to the brain, and then the brain adjusts our behaviors accordingly to optimally be in the state we're in. And regarding to food, of course, you would think that when we are hungry, it all depends on the digestive system. We are hungry, we eat, our stomach digests it, our intestines absorb the nutrients, and then the leftover, it's excreted. But actually, what makes us feel hungry, and this hunger doesn't come, for example, from our gut, it actually is the brain that tells us that we are hungry. And it's specifically this part of the brain, which is called the hypothalamus. So before I was telling you about the cortex, which is this colored areas here, but inside the brain, there's also very important areas. And in this case, the limbic system has this hypothalamus here, which is this area here. And this has, apart from regulating our food and water intake, it also has very important roles in maintaining body temperature and in reproduction. And also, so to be able to regulate this food and water intake, the hypothalamus has specialized neurons that can either make us hungry or make us feel that we are full and we don't need to eat anymore. But for the brain to be able to activate these areas for us to feel hungry or not, it needs to get information from the body. And the way it does it is by hormones. So hormones are like little messengers that circulate in the bloodstream, and then they reach the brain, and that are sent from different parts of the body to either tell the brain like, now you should feel hungry, or now you don't need to eat anymore because you have all the energy that you require at this point. And it comes from either energy intake areas such as the gut, or from energy storing parts, which would be, for example, the fatty tissue. And each of them secrete different types of hormones. First of all, the gut can secrete, for example, ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone that's secreted by the stomach when it's empty. So that's why it's a stimulating hormone. So if the stomach is empty, it starts secreting this hormone that reaches the brain and it's telling him like, I'm empty, you may be hungry soon. And on the other side, from the intestines, you can receive these CCK and PPY hormones that work the other way around. Whenever they sense that the small bowel is full, they emit this hormone. Is like, no, you don't need to eat anymore, because at this point you're doing the digestion and you're going to get the energy that you require. Similarly, the fatty tissue or the adipose tissue is the tissue that stores energy in the form of fat. And whenever this tissue secretes leptin, and whenever more adipose tissue you have, more leptin that it will be circulating around the bloodstream. And this is a signal for you that you do have enough energy to store. So it inhibits hunger because it's not necessary for the organism to eat at that point. And finally, another organ that is related to food signaling is the pancreas, which secretes insulin. So whenever there's there's sugar levels are high in the blood, the pancreas secretes insulin, which will make the cells intake the sugar and use it as a source of energy. And you may be familiar with insulin on the pancreas, and because whenever there's a problem with insulin, like it's either lacking or the cells are resistant to insulin, then you keep your blood levels are kept high, and that's when we get this pathology known as diabetes. So the way what I'm trying to say with all of these hormones and stimulating and inhibiting is that the way that we feel hungry is not by either a yes or no, it's actually a balance between these hormones. So our body keeps adjusting the hormone concentrations in our bloodstream, and this is related whenever we eat a meal. So when we are starting to feel hungry, the concentration of hunger stimulating hormones is almost at its peak, which is giving us this signal that we should be eating. And then while the hunger inhibiting hormones are at their lowest. And then whenever you eat, and the stomach, for example, starts sensing that it's full, so it will stop secreting the hunger stimulating hormone ghrelin, these levels will start decreasing and reaching a lowest point around at 30 minutes after, between 30 and 60 minutes after you eat. On the other side, the hormone inhibiting and the hunger inhibiting hormones will start increasing as they feel that the energy stores are being replenished. And again, they will readjust as the time passes to reach the pre-meal levels at around 4 hours after eating. So this was only one of the parts of like what an organism does when they sense hunger. So this would be all of this sensing hunger would be a food craving stage, but then you would also have 2 other stages. Would be then if you feel hungry, you would start exploring your environment. If you're an animal, explore your environment to seek for food. And then, of course, if that's the food that you feel you should be eating, you would consume it, digest it, and obtain the energy until your energy levels are low again, and you start the cycle all over. But a very important thing here would be to know which are the foods that an animal or a human needs to consume. And actually, it's very interesting because it seems that we should be biologically programmed to enjoy sweet and umami flavors, since they are associated with energy. Sweet foods normally contain sugar. Sugar is very high energetic molecule. On the other hand, proteins are also a source of energy. And whenever we feel the umami or the savory flavor, it signals protein. On the other hand, we have bitter flavors. Bitter flavors do have the opposite effect. They are supposed to be a signal for poison or toxic. So we should not be eating bitter foods because we should be programmed not to like it. But actually we do. We do eat leafy greens that are kind of bitter. We do enjoy our cup of coffee in the morning and chocolate and beer. And here I had to sweep home and have a Estrella Damm instead of a Superbock or a Sagres. So, but how is this possible? Why do we enjoy these foods that are bitter and supposedly we should not like them? It can be many reasons. Some of them could be even from our environment. We know that we have to eat our spinach because they are good for us. Coffee keeps us awake in the morning, so we might overcome the bitter flavor just because then we have that energy kick. Chocolate is part of many of our desserts, so we might associate it with more sugary and pleasant flavors. And beer, like, who actually likes their first sip of beer? I did not, but now I do like beer. So how is this possible? And actually it's because repeated exposure to bitter flavors can reduce this aversion to bitter taste. And what I'm going to be showing you now a study where a group of scientists tested this. So this is an example of the graphs I'm showing in my next slide. What they did is to measure the number of licks that a mouse gave to a pool of water that contain quinine. Quinine is a bitter flavor. It's part of the composition of tonic water. And they use this number of licks as a measure of how much the mice like the water. The more licks they gave to this water, it meant that they enjoyed it more than if they gave lower number of licks. On the horizontal line, what you're going to see is different concentrations of quinine in the test water. So in the left, it was water with very little quinine. On the right, with a lot of quinine. And what they did to the mice, so they had to do an experiment on the mice. It was not very bad, even though scientists sometimes we are not as nice as we should to our animals. We are very nice, but the experiments might seem not so nice. And this one, simply what they did, they had to have a diet that it was high on tannins, which is also a bitter flavor. So they compared how many licks these animals gave to this pool of water with quinine before and after this bitter rich diet. And here is what they found. So these are the mice that had a bitter diet. And if you look here, you see that at lower concentrations of quinine in the water, which are these 0.001 to 0.1. And if you look at the white dots that is after the diet, the animals normally gave more licks to the water with quinine than before the exposure to a bitter diet. But to make sure that this was because of the repeated exposure through the bitter diet, they also had another group of mice in which they did not have these bitter diets. They had a normal diet that was standardized in lab conditions, and what they saw is that between the same time points, so they did not have a before and after, but they compared the same time points. There was no difference between the after and the before in these animals that were not exposed to the diet with the tannins in it, meaning that these animals seem to be giving more licks and liking this water more as a result of being exposed repeatedly to having bitter taste. And this could help explain why we also might enjoy more beer now than we start at the moment that people start drinking beer. It's because after repetition, we learn to enjoy this flavor. But this learning can also work on the other way around. So if you remember from before, I've told you that normally we should like sweet flavors because sweet is glucose and glucose gives us energy. So what they did is to explore what happens if you can learn to not like a food. And in this case, it was another experiment in another set of mice. And what they did is they had animals drinking water with some saccharin in it, so a sweet flavor that supposedly they should like. But every time that they were exposed to this water, the animal would get a very, very, very mild shock that would be unpleasant for them, but not hurt them. And so after a repetition with this, they wanted to test how much they preferred water with saccharin, which would be the case before this experiment, and compared to normal water without the saccharin. They also had two other groups of mice, one that did not receive the shock and one that received a slightly stronger shock. So they had these three groups of mice. They trained them that every time that these two groups that they would get the shock, that every time they get water with saccharin, they would get this very mild shock. And then they tested how much they would prefer water with saccharin over plain water. And what they saw is that the animals that did not get the shock did not have any significant difference over the water with saccharin over than the plain water. But those animals that had received the shocks did decrease their preference for the water with saccharin. Meaning, so this learning that they associated the flavor of this more sweet water with the unpleasant experience of the shock. And again, they had to have a control situation in which to make sure that this was what the situation and what was happening. So they had another three group of mice that had the same design, but instead of water with saccharin, they were drinking water. So every time that they would drink water, they would get these mild shocks. And then they tested for their preference with saccharin. And they saw that in this case, the preference for water with this more sweet flavor did not change independently of this procedure. So in this case, it shows that the mice learned that this flavor was associated with this unpleasant experience. So what these two experiments tell us, and what I've been telling you so far, is that actually our food preference can be learned, even that it seems that we should be programmed to like or dislike some certain types of foods. They can be learned. But it's not only with this learning part that the associative, it also can be modulated by other factors. For example, by our environment or our culture. And one very nice example is, now, let me show you this advertising first, and then I'll let you know why. I don't know if some of you remember this.
I always play that one. I love it. It wouldn't work in Portugal. It would be banned because of competition. But...
Yeah, I think it's actually not allowed, right, to have this type of advertising in Europe.
But it's amazing.
So why did I no? Well, it's very cute, but I don't want to play it again. So why did I show you this? I'm showing you this because it is very well known that there is this very silent fight between those of us who like Pepsi and those of us who like Coke, even though that when you look at their composition, they are not so different, right? But if you ask me, I'm a Coke person, and if we were in a room, I would for sure ask for a show of hands of how many of you are from one or the other. But so what they wanted to do in the study that I'm going to show you now is actually realize how much of this preference is driven by branding only and not by the flavor itself. So what they had is they brought people into a lab and they gave them 2 cups of a beverage, and they asked them which one they preferred. And then there were some tricks in this test. So let me go one by one. So in the first experiment they brought people into the lab. They gave them 2 blank cups that they didn't know which one was which, and they told them one can be Pepsi and one can be Coke. Tell me which one of these 2 unlabeled glasses do you like the most? And what they found is that the results were more or less 50-50. When they were not showing which beverage was which, like people at random decided that they preferred one over the other. But then the trick came here. So first of all, they to another group of people, they gave them 2 glasses. One of them was unlabeled, and the other one clearly said it was Pepsi. And they told them that the other one could be one of the 2. It could be either Coke or Pepsi. And then they asked them to choose. And they again saw this 50%. The trick here was that actually the other glass was also Pepsi. But then this result would make sense, right? If you have the exact same beverage in the 2 cases, people will randomly choose one or the other. The funny part came whenever they did the same thing, but with Coke. So in this case, they show people that, look, I'm giving you this glass with Coke, and this glass, you don't know, it might be Coke or Pepsi, but in all the cases, it was always Coke. But even though it was the exact same beverage, everyone preferred the one that had the label of Coca-Cola, suggesting that our food preferences are not only driven by what our brain can like, what we might have learned to like by bad experience or good experience. It's also shaped by this type of things, by branding and like the image we have of food. But it's also an interesting, and then of course our food preferences are shaped by culture and by the exposure we had to a specific food type. And one thing that strikes me precisely is how we use ingredients, right? It's not only which ingredients you learn to like, but also how you use these ingredients. And one example could be the cinnamon. Like here in Portugal, it's very common to use cinnamon as part of sweet dishes. It's perfect with a pastel de nata. But then you go to other cultures and then you will find that they can use it as part of savory dishes, for example, a curry. And also with ingredients, like while it's not very common to see insects crawling around our dishes, we do find parts of the world where it's a high source of protein. And all of this is shaped by the history of the cuisine and the history of the region that's using these dishes. So overall, it's not that we're hardwired specifically all the same as humans to have a preference for a specific food. There's some learning involved in food preference. Finally, food preference also can be changed by the lifespan of the animal and in which physiological moment an animal can be found. It can also be seen, for example, in humans in craving. So there's this myth that women, when they're pregnant, can have like a craving for higher salt food or pickled food, for example. And what they did in this study that was performed in the Champalimaud Foundation, they found this also in flies. So they saw that female flies, after having mated with a male fly, they changed their preference for the food, and they preferred higher food with higher contents in salt. So for more of this, until now, it was me trying to talk about the homeostasis and how actually it's not only about maintaining the levels, but also how the brain can be modulated to like a specific type of food, and it's not only about maintaining energy. But there's also something else I wanted to talk to you about today, which was how we perceive food, how we perceive taste. And of course, this would run into the third function of the brain, with this perceiving like the sensory information, and this would be perception, which is how the brain selects, organizes, and interprets sensations which get from the physical environment through our senses. And when we talk about senses, the sense that comes to mind regarding food is taste, right? So how taste works, we might be familiar with it. Like we perceive taste through the tongue. In the tongue, there are these gustatory, and there are these papillae that contain gustatory cells, that these cells react to the chemicals in the food, and then they send the information to the brain regarding this. Here, there's another myth that I would like to debunk in the talk today. One thing that's very familiar to us is to see in school these organized areas in the tongue. This is the area for sweet, this is the area for bitter. That's also not exactly like this. There are taste areas around the tongue, but it's kind of intermixed, and you can find different type of papillae and specific for each flavor, mostly all around it. So, but where do we actually feel the taste? Is it the tongue? Actually, no. So as I've been saying, like the tongue has these cells that will react to the chemicals in the food and then send this information to the brain. And it is in the brain, in the gustatory cortex that, as I told you before, it's in the frontal part of the brain that has specific regions that will be triggered either by bitter taste or by sweet taste. So actually taste is also in the brain, not only in our tongue. And also another thing interesting is that it's not only, taste is not all there is to flavor, actually, because if we look at the 5 tastes, we only have 5 of them, which are bitter, sweet, umami, saltiness, and sour. But we cannot count how many flavors there are. And this is because flavor doesn't come only from taste, it also comes from the intermix of taste and other. So what our taste perception is also modulated by other senses, in this case, other. But not only other, it can also be modulated by other type of information, such as visual information. So we also are actually eating with our eyes. And here I'm going to be showing you very briefly a study from the group of Charles Spence. And what they did here is they want to see how the color of the plate affected the taste of the food. And what they did is they served this strawberry mousse that was exactly the same in both cases, with the same shape, and they were served in plates that were exactly the same except for the color. So they served it either in a black plate or in a white plate. And then they asked the participants for 4 characteristics of each of these mousses: what was the intensity, the sweetness, the quality, and how much they like it. And what they found is that whenever this strawberry mousse was served in a white plate, it was more intense, it was perceived as more intense, more sweet, and they liked it more. So, and also it's not only about where we serve the food. I forgot to mention it in this slide, sorry, but it's also about the food itself. If instead of changing the color of the plate, they would have added more red coloring, for example, in the mousse, it would also, another study found that it also was perceived as sweeter when it was, in this case, redder. So vision and other senses can affect our taste perception. And speaking of affecting taste perception and how we can manipulate and trick our brain, now I would like to bring it home and talk to you a little bit about virtual reality, which is what I've been doing. I'm not going to talk to you a lot about what I did during my doctoral degree because it's way out of the scope of this talk, but for sure, please feel free to ask. I always love talking about it. So also, since our senses can trick flavor perception, virtual reality is actually the perfect tool to also manipulate flavor perception. Why? Because when you find yourself in virtual reality, you are shown an environment that is not quite there. But given that virtual reality has this ability of tricking your brain as well by the sensory information, it could also trick how you perceive the flavor. And that's what I did during my PhD, that as I was telling you, that I was tricking the brain to perceive that an environment that was not real was real. It was actually a little bit further. So I had my subjects perceive that a hand that was in virtual reality was their hand, as if it was part of their own body. So, and that's because virtual reality environments present the users with a fake environment in a way that is perceived as real by the brain. And this is a result of proper integration of the multiple sources of information that the brain receives regarding the body-related information. Very quickly, if you want to know, what I did is I had the subjects in a setup like this, that they did not see their real hand. They saw this hand in the exact same position. And then they had to control it and move it. They had to do a task, which was simply turning off some lights in the environment. And then I asked them 2 questions. Is this your arm? And do you feel that you're controlling it? And the results were that whenever they were found in a situation that they were controlling this hand perfectly, the questions mostly were yes to both. This is a scale on how much they felt this arm being theirs and how much they felt they were controlling this arm. And most of the participants were reporting an agreement with feeling their arm was theirs and that they were controlling it. So what I'm trying to say with this is that virtual reality is a tool that can be used to trick the brain with the sensory information. And we have seen so far that sensory information is critical to flavor perception, not only regarding the taste, but it's also through visual information, which is very easy to manipulate in virtual reality, and also auditory information, for example, that is also easy to manipulate in virtual reality. So virtual reality can trick our senses about what is a part of our body. So what about the experience of food? So I was researching a little bit about what virtual reality and dining the state is, and I found this video about Aero banquets in which they trick their diners into this experience of perceiving the food that will be given in reality here through the virtual reality. And let me show you this. The video is very short, so let me show you with this. So they prepared these very tiny bites of food, and the person that were eating were in the virtual reality that was controlled. So they were playing with the tools. They could see their hands. So this is a little example of what was going on with them. And which advantages can have this tricking the brain into believing that the food tastes different that it actually is by their chemical composition, and either by manipulating the color in reality or even by providing this information through virtual reality. For example, if we can trick how much the sweetness of a food and how it is perceived, it could mean that the food could have a lower amount of sugar if we then provide this fake sweetness around the sensory information. Then we would maybe people that cannot eat sugar could be tricked into believing that they are eating a food sweeter than they are eating, and maybe make their experience more pleasant because they want to enjoy this type of sweetness. And this can be done in virtual reality. Of course, virtual reality has another extreme advantage, especially now in the times that we're living, which is that we are every time more isolated, especially elderly people, and we could be dining together but not together, and have the experience of social dining again through virtual reality. So I think there's a lot of potential that can be explored by using this type of sensory manipulation and the use of technology in dining experiences. So just to finish up and to wrap up again and to bring it out, so I told you it was a little bit more complicated than just the brain seeks for food and the food gives energy to the brain. Actually, the brain can be tricked into liking some type of food or the other. The food will still give energy to the brain, but maybe the brain then will enjoy this food more or less. And if the brain enjoys it, we enjoy it, because at the end of the day, we are our brain. And I hope that you have enjoyed your talk. I've really enjoyed giving it to us. I just would like to reinstate a little bit more if you want to go watch the video, because you'll see Charles Spence talking about giving many more examples about these gastrophysics type of things with the color of the food. And it's very interesting. Thank you very much. And of course, I will take questions.
Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you.
It was very, very interesting, and I was surprised when you said to finish up with the brain, and I said, oh my God, we're killing the brain. But so that was so funny. And then all the myths, the 10% myth and the tongue, the myth that you enlighten us about what we sometimes we just hear or we just read very, very briefly.
Or they make it to Hollywood, because the 10% myth was this Lucy film that then like she went super powered.
maybe, but that's a good thing. And then the idea of I brain you, right, instead of I love you. That could be very interesting for as an experiment as well, to see people's reactions. I think I will try to do some of your experiments on myself, but about coffee and like you drinking coffee without sugar, because apparently everybody says that, right? Everybody says, oh yeah, I got used to it slowly, and
Yeah.
I no longer use sugar in coffee. And that's very common to hear people saying that, right?
Yeah, of course. Well, in this case, it will be more of the associative thing. You associate your first, if you have a sugar with a high concentration of coffee, sorry, the other way around, coffee with a high concentration of sugar, you can trick your brain by every time, like, I still like this because it's still sweet, so a little bit less, and suddenly you're eating you're drinking bitter coffee, and you have not, well, you have realized it because you did that to yourself, but like it works.
It works. Yes, no, it's true. And we did have an attempt to have Charles Spence with us, but the connection was very bad, and we kept losing it. Actually, he sent me the presentation, but there's no use without him talking to us. So yeah, he's
great. It has to come from his. Yeah, I have his book here with me, actually.
yeah, it's a good one. And I don't know if you have questions, people. Yes. I can check here. I don't know. I cannot see Facebook. I don't know why, but I don't know if there are questions. Annelies.
Sorry. Yeah. I was going to put sound and I took off the camera. Sorry.
Your brain tricking you.
Yeah, no, it's the end of the day, not my brain tricking me.
Very good, very good.
Just tired, sorry. I was just going to comment on something that you showed on the end of your slides, the presentation, the Coca-Cola and Pepsi thing, the study that you connected brand with the perceived more interest, people perceiving more interest when they know the brand, to a study that I was recently reading about kids with obesity and their perceivement of food by the naming of the food. So if you said waffle or muffin, they would go wild and they would go to that. And so they were doing a study while maintaining that name, they would change the ingredients. So they would say waffle or muffin, but they would put good stuff inside, good things for the kids, but they would perceive as more enjoyment eating that. So it was very interesting to connect that with a way that we can really apply it, kind of tricking.
Yeah, of course. Like if you take the advantage of this in the good way, as you're saying, it's extremely useful, because it's a problem, right? Marketing, and because I think normally the food industry is using this the bad way. They are using this to sell high fatty, sugary foods to kids, and now many countries have a strong problem with obesity in children, and every time it's more and more common. So it should be used, as you're saying, the other way around, like promote healthy habits.
Yeah.
But that's a very interesting one. I'll look for it as well, like the stuff. Thank you.
Welcome.
I was muted myself. Our brain is really tricking us today. But I was going to ask Victòria, did you have is there any study or any experiment with having, like the picture you showed with a burger, like the first one, I think it was a drawing, someone, virtual reality and the burger, and then could you feed them something that was not a burger, but in virtual reality it would be a burger, right? And people would love it, but it's actually liver, I don't know, cooked with spinach and something.
I was actually kind of sad, because this is virtual reality is a topic extremely dear to me, and I thought there would be more stuff taking advantage of virtual reality to have these type of experiences. I did not find that many, so I can only speculate on what I would think would happen on that question. And for what I've seen in what you can do in virtual reality, I would say yes, for sure. Maybe you can give them something that maybe has the same shape as a burger and kind of the same texture, but then instead of being meat is a non-meat burger, and then they would think that's meat because the visual information of is weighted so strongly by the brain that if you see that you're having for example, a veal burger, right, and then you're eating something else, it may be possible to trick the flavor perception.
And then you have to just not let them smell anything. But I don't know if Rui wants to talk, because it just came closer to the camera.
I'm doing two things at the same time. I know the work of Vicky already for 3-4 years. I was visiting her sometimes at the Champalimau Foundation. We get really close friends after that. That's why, and it was a pleasure to have you here, Vicky. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was extremely fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm the one that appreciated it, and for sure all the students enjoy it. And that's it.
I think they have. I don't know if Conceição, you have a question for Victòria.
No, well, what Victòria said is more related with the sensorial part of the brain. Mm-hmm. And so my project is about food for the brain, but in terms of healthy mental health. So I don't know if you have something to say about that or not.
No, I have a lot of interest on that, actually. Like I think there's a lot of evidence connecting like the importance of what you eat in your gut, and then how the brain and the gut connect. Yeah. But I really don't know about that. I really would like, if you have information for that, for sure, I would be very interested in knowing about that.
Yeah, I have some, but it's you don't find a lot of information about that, and some information is a little bit contradictory. Mm-hmm. Say yes, there are facts, or they are studies that relate nutrients with the brain function, but then they are not sure if only food makes that effect, of if there are other things. So it's
I'm sure that it went.
It's not completely studied, I think.
Well, for sure, one thing that is known, I think, for example, now that you're talking about nutrients and brain function, it's the importance of B12, right? So a strong deficiency in B12 does have some cognitive impairment-like symptoms. So to the point that if you have an elderly person that could be having some type of dementia, one of the things you test is that he or she's not having a deficiency for B12, because sometimes it can produce symptoms that are similar to that, and they can be helped with a diet in some cases instead of So
That's very interesting, Victoria. I was just wondering if you are around on the 6th of July. We're going to have it's not a food talk, it's not public, it's for our students, food design students, and also for MIAC if they are interested as well. It's by Natasha Chevalier. Now she's currently living in France, but she worked and she was she researched in Britain, and she just published Food in Wartime Britain, but she's going to talk to us about food in time of extreme crisis. And the title is Reflection on Post-Apocalyptic Imaginary in the AMC series The Walking Dead and all the zombies and brain eating. So I don't know if you're interested in that as well. But you're more than welcome. I'll send you the link later when the time comes, and that could be interesting as well.
Please do. Otherwise, I'll bug Rui for it if you don't remember. It's actually interesting. Thank you for it.
It's a completely different perspective, and it could be interesting. And to see someone who is from cultural studies and maybe exchanging some ideas with you, that would be actually interesting. I don't know if there are any other questions. I know you're going to have a class, but we still have like 3 minutes. Let's say take advantage. Well, before we went live, Victoria was telling us that you could feel free to ask her some questions later if you're interested in that. So we will take advantage of that generous offer, Victoria. And it was a pleasure having you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It was a full day with two food talks, and I think they went wonderfully.